Welcome, friend, to this quiet corner of the past, where the air hangs heavy with the scent of charcoal, sulfur, and forgotten dreams. Tonight our story is not one of kings or conquerors, but of those who toiled in the flickering shadows of ambition, the medieval alchemists. We often picture them as wise, bearded men, poring over ancient texts in pursuit of mystical truths. But the reality was far grittier, a life of relentless, grueling labor, where the body was broken long before the soul was ever enlightened. It was a world where salvation and damnation were heated in the same crucible, and the line between science and sorcery was as thin as smoke. I'm so glad you're here to share this journey with me. Before we venture into the smoke-stained workshops of old, I'd love to hear where you're listening from. What city, what country, what hour of the night finds you seeking a story? It's a wonderful thought, all of us connected across the globe by the hush of history. If this kind of calm exploration brings you a measure of peace, please consider subscribing. We have many more tales to share. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In a cluttered stone chamber, tucked away from the prying eyes of the world, a young man named Thomas rises in the pre-dawn chill. He is not yet a man, but no longer a boy, his 14th year marked not by celebration but by the permanent soot etched into the lines of his hands. He is an alchemist's apprentice, and his day begins not with prayer or study, but with fire. The workshop is a cavern of controlled chaos, a place that exists outside the normal rhythms of the medieval village. There are no windows here, for the secrets within are too precious. And the work demands a darkness that allows the alchemist to read the language of glowing metal and colored flames. The air is a thick, acrid cocktail of sulfur, mercury vapor, and the ghosts of 1,000 failed experiments. Thomas has learned to breathe shallowly, to move through the haze with a practiced economy of motion. His young lungs already beginning to feel the familiar tightness that plagues his master. The master, a man named Alaric, is a stooped figure who seems forged from the same elements he commands. His eyebrows are long gone, singed away by years of leaning too close to the forge. His hands are a landscape of scars and calluses, the skin thickened and gnarled into something that barely resembles flesh. He is only 40, yet in the flickering light of the furnace he looks ancient, his body a testament to the brutal physical cost of his art. The pursuit of the Philosopher's Stone, the magnum opus, is not a gentle intellectual exercise. It is a war waged against the stubborn nature of matter, and the alchemist's body is the first casualty. Thomas's first task is always the bellows. This is not the small, handheld device one might imagine, but a great leather lung, often requiring the boy to use his entire body weight to operate. He pumps in a slow, steady rhythm, coaxing the charcoal in the athanor. The alchemist's furnace, from a dull red ember into a roaring white-hot heart. The heat is a physical presence, a monstrous beast that pushes against him, stealing the air from his lungs and baking the sweat onto his skin. In the depths of winter, this heat is a blessing, a small pocket of warmth in a world of freezing stone. But in the summer, the workshop becomes a crucible itself, a place of torment where the very air seems to vibrate with scorching energy. The physical labor is relentless and unforgiving. Alchemical processes are not passive. They are intensely hands-on. Grinding raw materials into fine powders with a heavy mortar and pestle is a task that can take hours, leaving Thomas's arms and shoulders screaming with a deep, burning ache. He learns to use his body as a machine, finding a rhythm that allows him to endure the monotony, his mind drifting as his muscles perform the repetitive, grueling work. The materials themselves are a constant source of danger. He handles lead, arsenic, and antimony, substances known for their transformative properties, but also for their slow, insidious poison. Alaric has taught him to wash his hands meticulously, to never touch his face while working, but in the grime and chaos of the workshop, such precautions are difficult to maintain. A fine dust of these toxic metals settles on every surface, a silent threat that enters the body with every breath, with every piece of bread eaten with unwashed hands. The true master of the workshop, however, is mercury. That liquid silver, the philosophical prima materia, believed to contain the spirit of all metals. It is beautiful, mesmerizing, and deadly. Alaric's work involves endless distillations of mercury, heating it in glass retorts until it turns to vapor, then cooling it back into its liquid form. The process is meant to purify the substance, to elevate its spiritual essence, but it also fills the unventilated chamber with invisible, toxic fumes. Thomas has already noticed the subtle tremor in his master's hands, the occasional memory lapse, the fits of irritability that seem to have no cause. These are the early signs of mercury's slow poison, a madness that all alchemists secretly fear. They call it the alchemist's curse, a price demanded by the very materials they seek to command. The work is not only physically taxing but mentally exhausting. Alchemical experiments often require constant attention for days, even weeks. Thomas and Alaric work in shifts, one sleeping on a thin straw pallet in the corner, while the other tends the fires, ensuring the heat remains perfectly constant. A slight dip in temperature at the wrong moment can ruin a month's work. This relentless vigilance wears on the mind, blurring the lines between waking and sleeping, between reality and the strange, symbolic dreams that the fumes seem to induce. Failure is a constant companion. For every small success, there are a dozen catastrophic failures. Glass retort shatters from the heat, spewing toxic liquid across the floor. A carefully prepared mixture turns into a foul-smelling, useless sludge. An expected reaction simply fails to occur, for reasons that remain stubbornly opaque. Each failure represents a loss of time, of precious materials bought at great expense, and a chipping away of the alchemist's hope. Yet they persist. Driven by a belief so powerful, it transcends the suffering of their bodies and the disappointment of their failures. They believe they are on the cusp of unlocking the greatest secrets of God and nature. The promise of the philosopher-esque stona, substance that could not only turn lead into gold, but also cure all disease and grant eternal life, is a lure too powerful to resist. It is a quest for perfection in a world defined by decay, a search for light in the darkest corners of human existence. For Thomas, this grueling life is his only hope. As an orphan boy with no inheritance, the path of an alchemist, however brutal, offers a chance at knowledge, status, and perhaps a wealth beyond the dreams of kings. He endures the burns, the aches, the poisons, and the constant threat of failure, all for the glimmer of that ultimate prize. He watches his master, a man slowly being consumed by his own art, and wonders if the price of enlightenment is the destruction of the very vessel that seeks it. The grueling nature of the alchemist's life was not confined to the physical torment of the workshop. It extended deep into the labyrinth of the mind. For Thomas, the apprentice, learning the craft was more than just mastering the bellows or recognizing the colors of heated metal. It was about learning an entirely new language, a vocabulary of symbols and metaphors designed to conceal as much as it revealed. Alaric's library consisted not of neat printed books, but of a handful of scrolls and mismatched manuscripts, their pages brittle and stained with chemical spills. The texts were written in a cryptic code, a deliberate obscurity that guarded the secrets of the art from the uninitiated. This was not knowledge to be shared freely. It was to be earned through years of devoted study and contemplation. Thomas would spend his few moments of rest poring over these texts by the dim light of a tallow candle, his brow furrowed in concentration. He learned that the world of alchemy was built upon three philosophical principles: mercury, the spirit; sulfur, the soul. Every substance, every process, was described through this trinity. He read of the Red King and the White Queen, whose symbolic chemical wedding was necessary to create the perfect offspring, the Philosopher's Stone. He puzzled over images of green lions devouring the sun, of dragons eating their own tails in an endless cycle of self-consumption, and of pelicans piercing their own breasts to feed their young with their blood. It was a universe of allegory, where a simple instruction for distillation might be disguised as a 7-line poem about a king ascending to heaven. Trying to follow a recipe felt less like chemistry and more like trying to solve a riddle posed by a particularly unhelpful sphinx. This secrecy served a dual purpose. On one hand, it was a test. Believed that the great work required not just technical skill, but spiritual purity. Only a mind patient enough to unravel these arcane mysteries was deemed worthy of receiving the ultimate truth. On the other hand, and far more practically, it was a shield. The alchemist's work existed in a dangerous gray area, perpetually teetering on the edge of heresy. The Church, the ultimate authority in medieval Europe, held a deeply conflicted view of alchemy. Many learned churchmen, from monks in their secluded cloisters to even high-ranking bishops, were fascinated by the art, seeing it as a legitimate form of natural philosophy, a way to understand the mind of God by studying the mechanics of his creation. They saw the transmutation of lead into gold as a mirror of the soul's journey from sin to salvation. But the wider institution was deeply suspicious. The very idea that a mere mortal could manipulate the fundamental essence of matter smacked of a dangerous pride, form of hubris that sought to usurp a power that belonged to God alone. The alchemist who claimed he could perfect nature was, in a sense, claiming he could improve upon God's work. A blasphemous notion that could easily attract the unwelcome attention of the Inquisition. This constant threat forced alchemists to cloak their work in layers of metaphor. They could not write plainly of their experiments for fear that their words would be twisted into confessions of sorcery. And so, the grueling mental work of deciphering these texts was a life-or-death necessity. A misinterpretation could not only ruin an experiment, but could also lead to accusations of witchcraft or demonic pacts. The spiritual journey of the alchemist was as fraught with peril as the physical one. The first stage of the great work was known as the negredo, or the blackening. This was a process of putrefaction and dissolution, where the base materials were broken down, reduced to their chaotic, primordial state. Alchemical texts spoke of this stage in terrifying terms. They wrote of killing the king, of drowning the sun in mercury, of reducing the body to black earth. To the medieval mind, steeped in Christian imagery of life and resurrection, this embrace of death and decay was deeply unsettling. It felt like a deliberate inversion of the sacred order, a flirtation with the forces of darkness. For an apprentice like Thomas, the psychological toll was immense. He was being taught to think in a way that was fundamentally at odds with the world outside the workshop walls. In church, he heard sermons about the sanctity of God's creation. In the workshop, he was learning to dissolve and kill that creation in order to remake it. This cognitive dissonance was a heavy burden, a mental crucible, that was every bit as intense as the physical furnace he tended each day. He had to learn to live with a divided mind, to speak one language to the world and another to his master, to hold in his head a set of beliefs that could, if discovered, see him condemned. Alaric himself embodied this conflict. He was a devout man who prayed before every major experiment, yet his work involved processes that seemed to mock the very tenets of his faith. He was seeking divine truth, yet his methods mirrored the secret rites of pagan mystery cults. This paradox was at the very heart of the alchemist's grueling existence. They were caught between worlds, the world of faith and the world of empirical, if esoteric, investigation. The world of the spirit and the world of poisonous, stubborn matter. They walked a razor's edge, the promise of ultimate enlightenment on one side, and the abyss of heresy and madness on the other. It was a path that demanded not just a strong back and a sharp mind, but a spirit capable of withstanding contradictions that would shatter a lesser man. The work was not just about transmuting lead, it was about transmuting the self, a process that often felt more like being burned away than being reborn. The grueling work of the forge and the torturous study of cryptic texts were merely the outer layers of the alchemist's suffering. The true ordeal lay in the nature of the questions they dared to ask. Questions that pushed them into realms of profound moral and spiritual danger. As Thomas grew more accustomed to the workshop's secrets, he began to understand that Master Alaric's ambitions stretched far beyond the mere transmutation of lead into gold. That famous goal, the one whispered about in taverns and royal courts, was only the most public face of a much deeper, more disturbing quest. The great work was not just about perfecting metal, it was about mastering the very principles of life and death. In the darkest corners of the workshop, hidden away from even the most trusted visitors, were texts that spoke of things that made Thomas's blood run cold. They whispered of the possibility of creating artificial life, of fashioning a homunculus, a tiny, perfectly formed human, grown not in a mother's womb, but in the sterile, unnatural heat of a glass vessel. The procedures described were a grotesque parody of creation, a recipe that blended arcane chemistry with what felt like pure necromancy. The texts called for human blood, sometimes menstrual blood, sometimes blood drawn from the young and vital to be mixed with other, even more unspeakable substances, and then sealed within a vessel to gestate in warm horse manure for 40 days. The homunculus, if successfully created, was said to possess knowledge beyond mortal understanding. It could reveal the secrets of the past and future, and guide the alchemist to the philosopher's stone. But it was a being born of profound transgression, an abomination in the eyes of God. Thomas would watch his master read these passages, his face a mask of terrible fascination. He saw, in Alaric's eyes, the intoxicating lure of this ultimate creative act to become a creator himself, to breathe life into lifeless matter. The moral weight of such an ambition was crushing. To even contemplate it was to step onto heretical ground, and to attempt it was to risk not just one's body, but one's eternal soul. The grueling nature of this temptation was a constant, silent presence in the workshop, a whisper that promised godlike power at the price of one's own humanity. Even the more mundane goal of creating gold was fraught with a unique set of perils that made the alchemist's life a perpetual tightrope walk. The promise of unlimited wealth was a dangerous one. Successful alchemist, one who could genuinely transmute base metals, held the power to upend the entire economic order of medieval Europe. Gold and silver were valuable precisely because they were scarce. If an alchemist could suddenly produce gold from cheap lead, he could devalue the currency of a kingdom overnight, bankrupting nobles, merchants, and the crown itself. This meant that a successful alchemist was, in many ways, more dangerous than a failed one. Kings and powerful nobles were caught in a paradox. They secretly funded alchemical research, dreaming of a limitless treasury that would allow them to finance wars and build grand monuments. They would provide alchemists like Alaric with laboratories and resources, protecting them from the church's prying eyes. But they did so with a deep-seated fear. What if the alchemists succeeded? The very power they sought to control would become a threat to their own stability. A wise king knew that if his court alchemists truly discovered the secret of transmutation, the first and most necessary act would be to have that alchemist quietly and permanently silenced. After all, a king doesn't want his currency to suddenly have the value of decorated pebbles. This created a grueling atmosphere of paranoia. The alchemist worked under the constant threat that his patron was also his potential executioner. Success and failure were equally dangerous paths. If he failed to produce results, he could be branded a charlatan and a fraud, tortured until he confessed to his deception, and then executed for stealing the noble's funds under false pretenses. The landscape of alchemy was littered with such figures. Men who promised gold, but delivered only smoke and disappointment, their lives ending in a dungeon or at the end of a rope. But if he succeeded, he became a state secret of the most dangerous kind. A man who knew too much, a living weapon whose very existence was a threat. Thomas saw this tension in his master every day. Alaric was beholden to a local baron who funded his research, a man who visited the workshop with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. The baron's questions were always polite, but they carried an undercurrent of impatience, of greed, and of menace. Alaric had to constantly produce small, tantalizing results, a slightly purer form of silver, a metal that resisted rust a little better, to keep the baron's patronage, while being careful never to reveal too much or promise too quickly. It was a deadly game of chess, where a single misstep could lead to ruin. The pressure to produce results, combined with the secrecy of the craft, also attracted a legion of frauds and tricksters who further poisoned the reputation of genuine practitioners. These charlatans would put on elaborate shows, using sleight of hand and chemical tricks to transmute metals in front of gullible nobles, only to vanish with their payment before the deception was discovered. This meant that genuine alchemists were constantly viewed with suspicion, their secretive methods and coded language seen as the tools of a con artist rather than a serious philosopher. The grueling task of the true alchemist was not just to unlock the secrets of nature, but to do so in a world that increasingly saw him as either a fool or a liar, a heretic or a swindler. Every day was a battle for credibility, for survival, and for the preservation of a sacred art that seemed determined to consume its followers. The alchemist's workshop was more than just a place of labor. It was an ecosystem of peril, a self-contained world where every object Every substance and every breath carried a potential threat. To an outsider, the chamber would have seemed like a vision of some minor cluttered hell. To an apprentice like Thomas, it was simply home. He learned to navigate the treacherous landscape of bubbling retorts and glowing furnaces with an instinct born of fear and repetition. The tools of the trade were not inert objects, but temperamental beasts, each with its own personality and its own way of inflicting harm. At the center of it all stood the Athanor, the philosopher's furnace. It was a brick-hand-clay monstrosity, squat and powerful, designed to maintain a constant, steady heat for weeks on end. It consumed vast quantities of charcoal, which Thomas had to haul in heavy sacks, his back screaming in protest. The Athanor was the heart of the workshop, but it was a fickle heart, prone to cracks and collapses that could send a shower of white-hot embers across the stone floor. Fire was the alchemist's greatest tool and his most constant fear. In a world built largely of wood and thatch, a single stray spark from the forge could mean the fiery end of not just their work, but their lives and perhaps half the village. Then there was the strange menagerie of glassware, each piece with a poetic name that belied its dangerous function. The alembic, with its curious domed cap and beak-like spout, was used for distillation, separating the volatile spirit of a substance from its grosser body. These glass vessels were fragile and expensive. They often shattered under the intense heat, sending scalding, toxic liquids hissing into the air. Thomas learned to recognize the high-pitched whine that preceded a crack. It's the sound that meant he had seconds to dive for cover. He also learned about the pelican, a circulatory vessel with two curved arms that allowed a liquid to endlessly distill itself, a process meant to mimic the Ouroboros, the serpent eating its own tail. Watching the liquid boil, rise as vapor, condense, and fall back into itself for days on end was a hypnotic, mind-numbing task that required unwavering vigilance. The processes themselves were named with a kind of poetic brutality that mirrored the work. They spoke of calcination, burning a substance to ash, of dissolution, dissolving it in powerful acids, of separation and conjunction, and most ominously, of putrefaction, letting a mixture rot and decay to release its hidden essence. The grueling nature of this work was not just in the labor, but in the intimate proximity to processes of death and decay. The workshop reeked of it, a constant reminder of the fine line between transformation and destruction. As the years of his apprenticeship wore on, Thomas noticed a subtle but profound shift in his master's focus. The relentless, frustrating quest for metallic transmutation, while never abandoned, began to share space with a new, even more audacious ambition. The principles that governed the perfection of metals, Alaric began to believe, could also be applied to the most complex substance of all, the human body. This was the dawn of a new kind of alchemy, one that would later be associated with figures like the famous physician Paracelsus. It was a form of alchemy that sought not just the philosopher's stone, but the elixir of life. This shift brought new and terrifying materials into the workshop. Alaric began acquiring rare herbs, animal parts, and minerals believed to have potent medical properties. But these were not simple herbal remedies. The alchemist's approach was to break these substances down to extract their quinta essentia, or fifth essence. Through grueling processes of distillation and purification, they believed that by doing so, they could create medicines of unparalleled potency. The problem was that many of these substances were violent poisons. Alaric began working extensively with antimony, a metal that could purify gold, but was also lethally toxic to humans. He experimented with arsenic and, of course, mercury. The alchemical doctrine was that a poison, if properly prepared and purified, could be transformed into a powerful medicine. The same substance that could kill could also cure, depending on the dose and the alchemist's skill. This was a terrifying philosophy to put into practice. It turned the workshop into a place where the line between healer and poisoner became perilously thin. Thomas was now tasked with preparing these new tinctures and elixirs. He would spend days grinding toxic minerals into a fine powder, his hands and lungs absorbing the poison with every movement. He assisted Alaric in complex distillations that produced liquids so corrosive they could eat through leather. The moral weight of this new work was a grueling burden. When they created a batch of metallic tincture, they were no longer just risking the loss of materials in a failed experiment. They were creating a substance that might be administered to a sick person. A successful tincture could bring fame and fortune, elevating the alchemist to the status of a miracle worker. But a failed one, a preparation that was improperly balanced or insufficiently purified, could result in a painful death for the patient and a charge of murder for the alchemist. The grueling life of the alchemist had acquired a new, more intimate horror. Before, his failures were his own, confined to the workshop. Now, his failures could walk out the door in a small glass vial, destined for the bedside of a trusting, desperate patient. The search for the elixir of life had transformed the alchemist from a reclusive philosopher into a figure who held the power of life and death in his scarred and trembling hands. The workshop, once a place of mere physical and intellectual torment, had become an arena of profound moral crisis. The alchemist's path, once a grueling road of physical labor and intellectual struggle, now descended into a moral abyss from which there was often no return. The creation of powerful tinctures and elixirs was an intoxicating taste of power. Alchemists, like Alaric, who had spent their lives seeking to command matter, now believed they could command life itself. But the secrets of vitality were not yielded easily, and the quest for the elixir of life led practitioners down their darkest path yet, demanding materials that could only be harvested from the dead. The workshop, already a place of smoke and poison, began to take on the charnel stench of the grave. Thomas, now a young man hardened by years of apprenticeship, witnessed this descent with a growing sense of dread. It began with Alaric's obsession with life essence. He argued that, to create a potion of immortality, one needed to start with ingredients that were saturated with vitality. This logic, twisted as it was, led him to the only source of such potent essence he could imagine: the human body. The work became nocturnal. Under the cloak of darkness, Alaric would send Thomas to the potter's field, the unconsecrated ground where the poor and the outcasts were buried, to gather materials. The task was horrifying. Thomas, armed with a shovel and a flickering lantern, would dig into the cold earth, his hands trembling as he unearthed the bones of the forgotten. He would return to the workshop with sacks of grave dirt, and most disturbingly, with human bones, which Alaric would calcify in the Athanor. Believing their ash contained a vital salt necessary for his work, the grueling nature of this task was not just in the physical act of grave robbing, but in the profound spiritual violation it represented. Thomas had been raised to revere the dead, to believe in the sanctity of the body as it awaited resurrection. Now, he was an accomplice in its desecration, his soul stained with a sin for which he feared there was no confession. He watched as his master's obsession grew. Bone dust was not enough. Alaric began to speak of the power of blood, the very river of life. He paid hangmen for vials of blood from executed criminals and bribed midwives for the placentas of newborns. All in the belief that these substances held the key to cheating death. The workshop became a chamber of horrors, shelves lined with jars containing things that no Christian man should ever possess. And all the while, the slow poison of the craft continued its work, not just on their souls, but on their minds. The constant exposure to mercury vapor was having a profound effect on Alaric. The tremor in his hands was now constant, a violent shaking he could no longer control. His memory, once sharp enough to hold entire libraries of alchemical knowledge, became fragmented and unreliable. He would forget steps in a procedure, or repeat the same process for days, having no recollection of his previous work. But the most terrifying symptom was the change in his personality. The quiet, obsessive scholar was becoming paranoid and prone to fits of rage. He accused Thomas of trying to steal his secrets, of conspiring with the Baron to ruin him. He began to see patterns and portents in everything: a crack in a beaker, the shape of a spill on the floor. All were interpreted as messages from a spirit world that seemed to be pressing in on him. He began to have visions. Thomas would find him staring into the swirling vapors of a distillation, speaking in hushed tones to beings that were not there. Alaric called them his guides, angels of knowledge sent to instruct him in the final stages of the great work. He claimed they spoke to him in a language of pure light, revealing formulas too profound for any written text. To Thomas, it sounded like madness, the incoherent ramblings of a mind being eaten away by poison. The line between divine inspiration and chemical-induced insanity had dissolved completely. This was the alchemist's ultimate grueling paradox. The very substances they believed would lead them to perfection and immortality were in fact destroying them, body, mind, and soul. They sought to purify matter, but in doing so, they poisoned themselves. They pursued an eternal, incorruptible life. But their quest filled their workshops with the instruments of decay and their minds with the phantoms of madness. The physical hardships, the burns, the smoke, the back-breaking labor paled in comparison to this internal decay. Thomas now lived in a state of constant fear. He was afraid of his master's violent outbursts, afraid of the toxic materials he handled every day, and afraid of the spiritual damnation that their work surely invited. Yet he could not leave. He was bound by his apprenticeship, but also by a terrible, morbid curiosity. He had to see where this dark path led. He had to know if his master's visions were truly madness, or if they were, as Alaric claimed, a glimpse into a reality that lay just beyond the veil of human perception. The grueling life of the alchemist was a trap. The initial promise of knowledge and power was the bait. The years of labor and study were the walls of the cage. And the final revelation, the dark truth of the art, was that the pursuit of perfection often required the complete sacrifice of one's own humanity.
Out the gold they sought
Was not the metal in their crucibles. It was the sliver of sanity they tried to cling to as their world dissolved into a nightmare of their own making. The grueling ordeal of the alchemist, as Thomas was beginning to learn, was not always a solitary one. His master's descent into paranoia and whispered conversations with unseen entities was not a unique affliction. Across the dark tapestry of medieval Europe, other men in other smoke-filled chambers were undergoing similar transformations. They were the ones who had pushed their art too far, who had stared into the crucible for too long and seen something other than science staring back. And in their shared obsession and shared madness, they began to find each other, forming a hidden network that was the dark shadow of legitimate alchemical study. This was no formal guild with public halls and registered members. It was a secret society, a brotherhood bound by forbidden knowledge and dangerous ambition. They called themselves the Order of Mortis Aurea, the Order of the Golden Death, a name that perfectly captured their twisted philosophy. They communicated not through letters, which could be intercepted, but through a language of symbols even more obscure than those found in common alchemical texts. Specific arrangement of nails on a church door, a seemingly random scratch on a tavern table, particular knot tied in a beggar's rope, these were their signs. Invisible to the uninitiated, but screamingly obvious to those who knew what to look for. Thomas made this terrifying discovery by accident. While cleaning a newly acquired manuscript for his master, a text, supposedly about the purification of salts, he noticed faint markings in the margins. They were not words, but tiny, intricate symbols he had never seen before. Later that week, he saw the same symbol chalked discreetly on the alley wall behind their workshop. When he mentioned it to Alaric, his master's reaction was not one of curiosity, but of cold, sharp fear, followed by a warning so severe that Thomas never spoke of it again. He understood then that they were not alone. His master was part of something larger, a conspiracy that operated in the spaces between words and in the silence of the night. This secret order represented the final, most terrible corruption of the alchemical art. While public alchemists like Albertus Magnus pursued their studies within the acceptable, if sometimes strained, boundaries of Christian doctrine, the Order of the Golden Death had abandoned all pretense of natural philosophy. They had plunged headlong into sorcery. Their laboratories were no longer workshops. They were temples to forbidden powers. Thomas would sometimes catch glimpses of this other work when his master believed him to be asleep. He saw Alaric tracing circles on the floor with powders made from crushed bone, saw crucifixes hung upside down over the forge, heard him chanting in guttural languages that made the very air feel thick and heavy. Their goal was no longer the philosopher's stone of legend, the substance of perfection and healing. They sought its grotesque inversion, a creation they called the lapis mortis, the death stone, where the philosopher's stone was said to transmute lead into gold. The death stone was designed to transmute life into power. It was an artifact of vampiric immortality, a cursed object that could grant its wielder an unnaturally long life. but only by consuming the life force of others. The grueling quest for perfection had been abandoned for a far easier and far more evil path to power. The creation of the Death Stone was a ritual of pure blasphemy, a systematic inversion of everything sacred. The process, as described in the fragmented texts Thomas sometimes saw, required the complete corruption of the four alchemical elements. Water had to be drawn not from a pure spring, but from a well poisoned with the bodies of the plague-ridden. Earth had to be gathered from the crossroads where a suicide was buried. Air had to be captured in a glass vial during the final despairing exhalation of a dying man. And fire had to be kindled with wood from a tree that had been struck by lightning, a tree that God himself had smote. Each ingredient was not just a physical component, but a vessel of spiritual sickness. The rituals they performed were hideous parodies of the Christian Mass. Instead of wine, they used blood. Instead of the host, they elevated concoctions of molten silver and human bile. Their hymns were the Enochian chants that Alaric whispered to his guides. Each syllable a key intended to unlock a door that should have remained sealed for all eternity. Thomas's life, already a grueling regimen of labor and fear, now became a waking nightmare. He was trapped, an unwilling acolyte in a demonic cult. The members of this order, scattered across Europe, were not just crazed hermits. They were often men of influence, disgraced monks, heretical physicians, even court advisors who practiced their dark arts in secret. They used their alchemical knowledge not to heal or enlighten, but to create subtle poisons, to weave illusions, and to gain power over the minds of others. They were the hidden puppeteers of the medieval world, their influence felt in sudden illnesses that befell their enemies, in political decisions that seemed to defy logic, and in the spreading sense of paranoia and dread that seemed to hang over certain noble courts. The grueling life of the alchemist was no longer just a personal struggle against matter and madness. It had become a conspiracy against the very fabric of creation. Thomas realized the horrifying truth. The madness he saw in his master was not an isolated case of mercury poisoning. It was a shared consciousness, a spiritual infection spreading through this hidden network, turning seekers of wisdom into willing servants of the dark. The Order of the Golden Death did not grow its ranks through open recruitment. Its power lay in its secrecy and its uncanny ability to identify individuals whose ambition or desperation made them vulnerable. They were masters of seduction, not with promises of crude wealth, but with the one thing a true scholar could never resist: the promise of forbidden knowledge. Their recruiting efforts often targeted the brightest and most frustrated minds in Europe, physicians who had reached the limits of their art, theologians who wrestled with doubts, and young, brilliant students who chafed under the rigid doctrines of the universities. Consider the story of Helena of Prague, a young woman of uncommon intellect who, in the early 15th century, disguised herself as a man to gain access to the university's famous library. Her mind was a razor, and she quickly surpassed her peers in the study of natural philosophy. But she lived a grueling life of constant fear, terrified that her secret would be discovered and she would be cast out, her dreams of knowledge turning to ash. It was this combination of brilliance and vulnerability that brought her to the order's attention. An intermediary, a respected professor who was secretly a high-ranking member, approached her. He spoke of his admiration for her work, hinting that he knew her secret and offered not a threat but a solution. He spoke of a private laboratory where she could work without fear of exposure, of access to texts that had been banned by the church for centuries, and of patrons who valued knowledge above all else, regardless of the scholar's gender. For Helena, it was a dream she never dared to imagine. She accepted without hesitation, blind to the true nature of the web into which she was stepping. At first, the work was exhilarating. The laboratory was better equipped than any she had ever seen. The manuscripts they provided contained insights that were generations ahead of the university's teachings. She was assigned tasks, experiments in distillation, and the purification of metals. And her new patrons praised her results lavishly. They were slowly, carefully luring her in, building her trust, while subtly corrupting her research. The texts she studied, she would later realize, had been subtly altered. With heretical concepts woven into legitimate procedures, the laboratory itself, she did not know, had been built over a plague pit. its very foundations saturated with an energy of suffering and despair that influenced her thoughts in ways she could not perceive. Gradually, her research began to shift. Guided by her patrons, her work moved from the study of plants and minerals to the study of animal humors, and then inevitably to the study of human vitality. Her goal, she was told, was a noble one: to create a true homunculus, an artificial being that could serve humanity. Its mind a blank slate upon which the greatest knowledge could be written. But the ingredients required grew more and more disturbing. The process, as dictated by the order's texts, was a masterpiece of perverted creation. It began with the acquisition of a recently departed soul, one that had not yet fully passed to the afterlife. The order had developed methods for this, spiritual traps laid at the bedsides of the dying. The captured soul was then to be housed in a specially prepared mixture of human blood, semen and bone marrow, all sealed within a glass vessel shaped like a womb. Helena, her moral compass now skewed by years of isolation and immersion in the order's twisted philosophy, performed these rituals with a chilling detachment. The grueling work, once a source of fear, had become routine. She watched as the fleshy mass within the vessel slowly took on a human form. It was her greatest achievement, the culmination of all her study. When the homunculus was born, a tiny, pale creature with unblinking eyes, she felt a surge of pride. But that pride turned to absolute horror when she looked closely at its face. It was the face of her younger brother who had died from a fever the previous year. The truth crashed down upon her with the force of a physical blow. The order had not given her the tools for creation. It had given her the tools for desecration. It had captured her brother's wandering soul and provided it to her as raw material for her ghastly experiment. The homunculus was not a new life. It was a prison for a life that had already ended. The sounds it made, which she had mistaken for infant-like coos, were the muffled screams of a trapped and tortured spirit. The grueling realization of what she had done shattered Helena's mind. She had been a pawn in a game whose rules she never understood. Her thirst for knowledge twisted into a tool for unimaginable cruelty. She tried to destroy her creations, to burn the laboratory and expose the order's monstrous work. But the order was always one step ahead. Her patrons arrived not with praise, but with chains. They told her that her work was not finished, that she was too valuable to lose. She was taken to a more secure facility, a place deep beneath a remote castle, where her brilliance would continue to serve the Order of the Golden Death, whether she wished it or not. Helena of Prague, once one of the brightest minds of her generation, became just another tool. Her life a grueling testament to the Order's true purpose, not to enlighten humanity, but to consume it. The isolated horrors of individual laboratories like Helena S. in Prague or Alaric S. in his forgotten village were but single threads in a tapestry of corruption that was being woven across the whole of Europe. The Order of the Golden Death was not merely a collection of degenerate scholars pursuing personal power. It was an organized, patient, and terrifyingly ambitious conspiracy. Their ultimate goal was not the creation of a single death stone or a handful of homunculi. It was something far grander, a plan that would take centuries to bring to fruition, the complete and permanent merging of their reality. With the alien dimensions of their otherworldly patrons, they called it the Magnum Maleficum, the great evil work. This was not a single ritual, but a vast, synchronized undertaking. The Order's masters, no longer entirely human themselves, spent generations mapping the esoteric geography of the continent. They identified ley lines, places where the Earth's spiritual energy flowed strongly, and nexus points where the veil between worlds was naturally thin. Their plan was to conduct dozens of simultaneous rituals at these key locations, each designed to weaken the dimensional barriers. It's all timed to coincide with a rare astronomical alignment that occurred only once every 700 years. The cumulative effect, they believed, would be a catastrophic, irreversible tearing of the fabric of reality, creating a permanent gateway for their masters to cross over. Thomas, now deeply enmeshed in his master's work, began to see the signs of this grand conspiracy. He saw star charts that marked not just constellations, but the alignment of cities: London, Rome, Paris, and Prague. He found letters written in the Order's impenetrable code that spoke of coordinating shipments of special materials to colleagues in distant lands. The grueling, secretive work of their small workshop, he realized with a dawning horror. was just one small cog in a continental machine of cosmic destruction. The souls they harvested, the abominations they created, were not ends in themselves. They were fuel for a much larger fire. To achieve this, the Order had to do more than just practice their art in secret. They had to subtly reshape human society to serve their ultimate purpose. They began a campaign of infiltration that was as brilliant as it was insidious. Members of the Order, using the wealth and influence gained from their art, secured positions in royal courts, universities, and even within the church itself. From these positions of power, they could misdirect investigations, suppress dangerous knowledge, and steer the course of human progress in directions that favored their great work. They founded secret schools, disguised as legitimate places of learning, where the children of the elite were educated. Alongside mathematics and rhetoric, these students were taught a corrupted form of natural philosophy, one that subtly introduced the Order's worldview.
Ow.
They were taught to see the world not as God's stable creation, but as a fluid, malleable substance that could be reshaped by those with sufficient knowledge and will. The most promising of these students were then recruited into the Order's deeper mysteries. Even public architecture was influenced by their designs. Cathedrals and castles built under the patronage of Order aligned. Nobles often contained hidden symmetries and geometric ratios that served a dual purpose. To the public, they were marvels of Gothic design. To the initiated, their spires acted as spiritual antennae, stained glass windows as focusing lenses, all designed to channel and amplify the energies needed for the Magnum Maleficum. Entire cities became ritual circles, their inhabitants unknowingly living and working within vast engines of dimensional corruption. The most grueling aspect for a low-level participant like Thomas was the sense of utter powerlessness. He was trapped in a conspiracy so vast and ancient that resistance seemed not only futile, but nonsensical. The world he had known was a facade, its history and progress secretly guided by men who had sold their humanity for a glimpse of cosmic power. The very air he breathed felt tainted by their ambition. He saw the growing madness in his master, Alaric, not as a personal tragedy, but as a symptom of a world-spanning disease. The Order's influence was a slow, creeping poison. They sponsored art that accustomed the public to disturbing, otherworldly imagery. They encouraged theological debates that weakened the Church's authority and introduced concepts of spiritual relativism. They manipulated trade routes to ensure the flow of rare alchemical ingredients, while simultaneously creating economic instability that made people more desperate and thus more susceptible to the Order's promises. They were not merely waiting for the world to end. They were actively, patiently, and systematically dismantling it from the inside out, preparing it to be rebuilt in the image of their alien gods. The grueling life of the alchemist was no longer a personal quest for gold or immortality. It had become a role in a cosmic horror story, and the final act was fast approaching. But even in a world sinking into supernatural corruption, humanity's spirit of resistance was not entirely extinguished. The Order of the Golden Death, for all its power and careful planning, had made a critical miscalculation. They believed their knowledge was absolute and their victory inevitable. They failed to account for the quiet, stubborn pockets of the world that still held to older, saner truths. The growing disturbance in the fabric of reality, the spiritual sickness spreading across the land, did not go unnoticed. And from the shadows, a resistance began to form. This was not an army of knights or a decree from the Pope. The institutions of power had been too deeply infiltrated. Instead, the first to fight back were those who lived on the margins, those whose knowledge was not of books and universities, but of the earth, the stars, and the human heart. Folk healers in remote villages noticed that their traditional remedies were failing against new, unnatural illnesses. Midwives saw a disturbing increase in stillbirths and infants born with strange afflictions. Even simple farmers felt a wrongness in the soil, a sterile quality that had never been there before. These were not men and women of influence, but they understood the natural order, and they knew it was being violated. They were joined by others. Religious mystics, cloistered away in contemplative orders, began to be tormented by visions. They saw cities of black glass, skies filled with screaming geometry, and vast, alien entities moving just behind the veil of the world. They recorded these nightmares, recognizing them not as mere dreams, but as warnings from God about a spiritual plague consuming Christendom. And, most importantly, they were joined by a new generation of alchemists, practitioners who, through their own studies, had glimpsed the same cosmic truths as the Order, but who had recoiled in horror rather than embracing the corruption. These disparate groups, communicating through their own secret channels, began to form a loose alliance. They called themselves the Guardians of the Natural Order, and their mission was not to gain power, but to restore balance. Their life was even more grueling than that of their corrupted counterparts. They worked with limited resources, in constant danger of being discovered by both the Order and the Inquisition, who would see little difference between their protective magic and the Order's destructive sorcery. Our leader was a mysterious figure known only as Father More, a former high-ranking member of the Dominican Order who had once been tasked with investigating alchemical heresies. In doing so, he had uncovered the true extent of the Order's conspiracy and realized that the Church's methods were wholly inadequate to combat it. He had left his official life behind, faking his own death to work in the shadows, gathering knowledge and recruiting allies for the secret war that he knew was coming. The Guardians' methods were the mirror image of the Order's, where the Order sought to tear holes in reality. The Guardians learned to weave them shut. They developed rituals of sealing and binding, creating complex wards that could shield entire towns from dimensional incursions. They couldn't destroy the rifts, but they could contain them, creating spiritual quarantine zones around the Order's most corrupted sites. This work was incredibly dangerous. Placing a ward required practitioners to enter these blighted areas, exposing themselves to the same maddening energies that had consumed their enemies. Many Guardians were lost in these early battles, their minds shattered or their bodies twisted by the forces they sought to contain. For the apprentice Thomas, trapped in Alaric's workshop, the existence of the Guardians was a rumor, a desperate hope he clung to in his darkest moments. He began to look for their signs, the countersymbols that were said to be the only protection against the Order's influence. One day, while gathering herbs in a forest known to be a place of strange phenomena, he found one, a triple spiral knot carved into the bark of an ancient oak, a symbol so old it predated alchemy itself. He felt an immediate sense of peace, a quiet in his mind that he hadn't experienced in years. He knew then that he was not alone in his grueling struggle. The Guardians also began the painstaking work of creating a counter-archive. They sought out and preserved untainted alchemical texts, separating the legitimate knowledge of natural philosophy from the Order's corrupting influence. They documented the Order's history, their methods, their goals, creating a body of knowledge that could be used to fight them. This was a grueling task of historical detective work, piecing together a hidden history from fragmented manuscripts, deathbed confessions of former members, and the psychic echoes left behind at sites of great alchemical rituals.
Oh.
They were fighting not just for the future, but for the very memory of the past. To ensure that the true nature of alchemy's dark turn would not be forgotten, the quiet war had begun, a struggle fought not on battlefields, but in libraries, laboratories, and the souls of those who dared to seek forbidden knowledge. The secret war for the soul of the world was fought not with armies, but with symbols, not with swords, but with secrets. As the date of the great astronomical alignment drew closer, the Guardians of the Natural Order realized that their defensive measures were no longer enough. Containing the Order's corruption was a losing battle. They had to go on the offensive. They needed to disrupt the preparations for the Magnum Maleficum, to sever the threads of the great dark web before it could be drawn tight. This meant moving from the protection of towns to the hunting of Menor, what was left of them. Father Murray, using the vast, secret knowledge he had accumulated, began to orchestrate a series of targeted strikes. These were not military raids, but surgical operations of supernatural warfare. A small team of Guardians, armed with blessed iron, relics of saints, and knowledge of the Order's own twisted rituals, would descend upon a suspected laboratory. Their battle was one of counter-sorcery. They would shatter ritual circles, neutralize trapped entities with chance of binding, and seize corrupted texts before they could be destroyed. One such raid took place in the catacombs beneath Rome, where a high-ranking member of the Order, a cardinal, had constructed a laboratory powered by the desecrated tombs of early Christian martyrs. The battle that raged in those ancient tunnels was a silent, grueling affair. The Guardians faced not men, but illusions, summoned phantoms, and the very stones of the catacomb, animated by malevolent will. They fought with faith and cold iron, their every step a struggle against a reality that had been twisted into a weapon against them. They succeeded, but at a terrible cost. 2 of the 5 Guardians who entered that subterranean hell never returned, their souls claimed by the very forces they had fought to contain. Back in his workshop, Thomas found himself at the heart of this escalating conflict. The symbol he had found in the forest had been a test, a breadcrumb left by the Guardians. By recognizing it and not reporting it to his master, he had unknowingly declared his allegiance. The Guardians now saw him as a potential asset, a source of information deep inside the enemy's camp. But the Order saw him as something else entirely. A liability. Alaric, his mind now almost completely lost to the influence of his otherworldly patrons, had begun to sense Thomas's wavering loyalty. The whispers in his head told him the boy was a threat. The attack came on a moonless night. Thomas was alone in the workshop, tasked with monitoring a long, slow distillation. The usual sounds of the forge were absent, replaced by an unnerving silence. Then he heard a soft, wet, scraping sound coming from the darkened corner of the chamber. He held his lantern aloft and his heart turned to ice. One of Helena of Prague's creations, a homunculus, had found its way here. It was a grotesque parody of a child, its skin pale and translucent, its eyes burning with a cold, ancient intelligence. It moved with an unnatural, jerking motion, its tiny hands tipped with razor-sharp claws made of obsidian. The grueling years of his apprenticeship, the endless hours of labor and fear, had prepared him for this moment in ways he never could have anticipated. He did not scream. He acted. He knew from observing his master that these creatures were not truly alive in the natural sense. They were animated by trapped spiritual energy, housed in alchemically prepared flesh, and that flesh had weaknesses. Thinking faster than he ever had in his life, Thomas grabbed a beaker of aqua regia, the powerful acid Alaric used to dissolve gold. As the creature lunged, he hurled the contents at it. The acid struck the homunculus with a sickening hiss. The creature shrieked, a sound that was not of this world, a chorus of 100 trapped voices crying out at once. Its flesh began to smoke and dissolve, but it did not stop. Scrambled towards him, its face a mask of rage. Thomas backed away, stumbling over a pile of iron bars. It was then he remembered a lesson from his earliest days cold iron. Alaric had always taught that cold forged iron, untouched by the corrupting heat of the forge, disrupted supernatural energies. He grabbed the heaviest bar he could lift and swung. The iron bar connected with the creature's head with a dull, wet thud. The homunculus convulsed, and then fell still, its otherworldly light dimming until it was just a pile of dissolving flesh and shattered bone on the stone floor. Thomas stood, panting, his body shaking, the iron bar still clutched in his hands. He knew he could not stay. Alaric would know what he had done. The Order would send something else, something worse. His grueling life as an apprentice was over. Oh, he was a fugitive. As he gathered a few precious untainted texts in a small pouch of silver, he heard a soft tapping at the workshop's secret exit. He froze, expecting another monster. But the voice that whispered through the door was human. It was a guardian, one who had been watching, waiting. "The time has come to choose, boy," the voice said. "Their road or ours." Without a backward glance at the workshop that had been his prison for so long, Thomas stepped out into the night and chose the grueling path of resistance. The escape of an apprentice and the loss of a few. Provincial laboratories did little to slow the momentum of the Order of the Golden Death. In fact, the Guardians' fledgling resistance had the opposite effect. Sensing that their long-held secrecy was beginning to fray, the masters of the Order accelerated their plans for the Magnum Maleficum. The time for subtlety was over. Their victory, they believed, was at hand, and a new, arrogant confidence began to permeate their operations. They abandoned the pretense of hiding in the shadows and started to work more openly. Their hubris, a glaring beacon for those who knew how to see it. Across Europe, the signs of their final preparations became more apparent and more terrifying. They established large, well-funded laboratories in the heart of major cities, often under the protection of a powerful noble or a corrupted church official who had been promised a place in the new world to come. Assassinations of key figures who opposed them, inquisitive bishops, royal advisors who asked too many questions, guildmasters who refused to cooperate, became more frequent and more brazen. They were no longer just weaving a web or clearing the board for their final move. The most grueling task for the Order was the stockpiling of the immense quantities of corrupted materials needed for the continent-spanning ritual. Their agents scoured the land, gathering ingredients whose very names were a litany of horror. They bought the silence of battlefield surgeons to harvest the dying breaths of soldiers. They traded with plague cart drivers for access to mass graves. They sponsored pirates to wreck ships carrying specific cargoes, not for the gold, but for the despair of the drowning sailors, which they believed could be alchemically captured and distilled out. The world's suffering had become their most valuable commodity. This escalating activity began to poison the very atmosphere of the late 15th century. A sense of wrongness, of a world out of balance, crept into the lives of ordinary people. They saw it in the unseasonable weather that ruined crops, in the strange new sicknesses that defied the remedies of local healers, and in the panicked whispers of monstrous births and livestock born with grotesque deformities. They didn't know the cause, but they felt the effect, a growing, pervasive dread, as if creation itself was holding its breath in anticipation of some terrible event. For the guardians of the natural order, this was a race against a rapidly ticking clock. With the intelligence brought by defectors like Thomas, they finally began to understand the true, horrifying scale of the Order's plan. Working in hidden sanctuaries, a forgotten library beneath a monastery in Spain, a sealed chamber in the heart of the Venetian ghetto, they pieced together the puzzle. Thomas, haunted by the memory of Alaric's workshop, found his grueling apprenticeship being put to a new, redemptive use. The coded language he had struggled to learn was now the key to deciphering the Order-esque communications. The horrific procedures he had been forced to witness now allowed him to identify the nature of the materials the Order was gathering. The work was mentally and spiritually exhausting to decipher the Order's plans. The Guardians had to immerse themselves in the very knowledge that had driven their enemies to madness. They pored over texts filled with blasphemous rituals and alien geometries, their minds constantly battling the corrupting influence of the words they read. They performed dangerous scrying rituals to spy on the Order's activities, risking their own sanity with every glimpse into the abyss. Father Marai led these efforts with an iron will, his own past as an alchemist, giving him a unique insight into his enemy's mindset. But even he felt the strain. The grueling weight of holding back the apocalypse was a burden that aged him years in a matter of months. They confirmed the timing of the ritual and eclipse that coincided with a planetary alignment not seen in centuries, now just 3 years away. They identified the primary nexus points for the ritual, confirming Thomas's fears about London, Paris, and Rome, but also uncovering dozens of other, smaller sites that formed the vast network. The picture that emerged was one of apocalyptic grandeur. The Order planned to use these sites as a colossal lens, focusing the combined spiritual energy of Europe's oldest and most powerful cities to tear a hole in reality, large enough for their patrons to stride through. The Guardians were hopelessly outmatched. They were a scattered handful of scholars, mystics, and repentant alchemists against a wealthy, well-connected conspiracy that had been planning this for generations. But they had one advantage. The Order, in its arrogance, did not believe they could be stopped. They saw the Guardians as little more than a minor nuisance, a final flicker of resistance before the dawn of their new age. This hubris was the only weakness the Guardians could exploit. Their only hope was not to defeat the Order in a direct confrontation, but to find a flaw in the great evil work itself, miscalculation. A structural weakness in the grand ritual land, to strike at that single point with all their concentrated force at the precise moment of its execution. The fate of the world would hang on a single, desperate gamble. The grueling hidden war was about to reach its climax. The night of the final convergence fell over Europe like a shroud. They stood in their ritual circles, their forms now barely recognizable as human. their voices rising in a discordant chorus that spoke in the languages of dead stars and alien geometries. At the heart of each nexus point, the great alchemical vessels, forged from impossible materials and fueled by trapped souls, began to hum with power. The air grew thick and ozone-heavy, crackling with an energy that warped light and bent shadows into monstrous shapes. In London, deep beneath the tower, the River Thames, which flowed over their hidden laboratory, began to steam and bubble, its waters turning the color of rust. Then, the rifts began to open. They were not dramatic tears in the sky, but shimmering, heat-hazed distortions in the air, silent wounds in the skin of reality. And from these wounds, lesser entities began to slip through beings of living shadow. Things with too many limbs. Creatures whose forms were an insult to the natural order. They were the scouts, the outriders, for the vaster, more terrible intelligences that waited beyond. It was at this moment, as the ritual approached its first point of no return, that the guardians of the natural order struck. They had planned for this night for years, their every action geared towards this single, desperate gambit. Father Murray led the main assault on the Order's central command, a vast underground complex hidden in the Black Forest of Germany. His team of guardians were not knights in shining armor, but grim-faced scholars and mystics, armed with knowledge as their primary weapon. Thomas, no longer an apprentice but a seasoned, if reluctant, warrior in this secret war, was with them. His grueling years under Alaric had given him a unique and terrible gift. He understood the Orderous logic from the inside. As they breached the outer defenses of the complex, it was Thomas who recognized the patterns in the warding circles. Identifying a flaw, a single point, where the web of magical defense was weakest. He guided them through a maze of alchemical traps and summoned sentinels, his mind a battlefield of remembered horrors and newfound purpose. The confrontation was a nightmare of controlled chaos. The Guardians' blessed iron blades clashed against the Order's weapons, which were not forged from simple steel, but from solidified despair and crystallized hatred, their edges screaming as they cut through the air. The battle was fought on multiple fronts. In the physical realm, it was a desperate struggle of steel and strength. But on the spiritual plane, it was a war of wills. Guardians chanted prayers of binding, their faith a shield against the corrupting influence of the Nexus. The Order's members countered with incantations that attacked the mind, projecting visions of cosmic dread and personal failure directly into their enemies' souls. Thomas found himself face to face with what had once been his master, Alaric. The man was gone, his body now a mere vessel for a powerful, ancient entity. Its eyes were multifaceted points of cold light, and its voice was the grinding of tectonic plates. It offered Thomas's power, knowledge, a place in the glorious new world that was dawning. It showed him visions of a universe remade, free from the petty constraints of human morality. For a moment, Thomas felt the old pull, the lure of ultimate knowledge that had first set him on this path. But then he remembered the homunculus with his brother's face, the screams of the trapped souls, the quiet dignity of the guardians who fought for a world he still believed was worth saving. He raised the cold iron bar he now carried as his only weapon and charged, his own desperate prayer on his lips. The grueling battle for reality had begun, and its outcome was terrifyingly uncertain. The battle for reality raged on fronts both seen and unseen.
Oh.
While Father Morai's main force engaged the Order's leadership in the Black Forest. Smaller teams of Guardians launched simultaneous assaults on the secondary nexus points across Europe. In the damp cellars of London, they fought things made of fog and malice. Beneath the streets of Paris, they battled alchemical constructs of animated stone and brass. Every victory was paid for in blood and sanity. The Guardians were not soldiers. They were librarians, physicians, and mystics, and the grueling toll of this supernatural combat was breaking them. But they held the line, their desperate courage fueled by the knowledge that they were humanity's last and only hope. At the heart of the great ritual, Thomas faced the being that wore his master's face. The creature that was once Alaric moved with an unnatural speed, its limbs contorting in ways no human body should. It no longer fought with weapons, but with reality itself. It would pluck moments from Thomas's past, the terror of the graveyard. the guilt of his complicity, and project them into his mind as psychic weapons. But Thomas, forged in the grueling crucible of his apprenticeship, had developed a resilience he never knew he possessed. He had lived with fear for so long it had become an old, familiar cloak. He pushed past the illusions. The cold iron bar his only defense against the creature's physical attacks. He knew he could not defeat it. The entity was too powerful, its knowledge too vast. But the Guardian's plan had never been about defeating the Order's masters. It was about breaking their work. As the creature lunged again, Thomas ignored the attack and threw himself toward the central alchemical vessel. The heart of this specific ritual node was a crystalline sphere pulsing with a sick purple light containing the swirling energies of 100 trapped souls. It was the anchor point for this part of the convergence. He brought the iron bar down with all his strength. The crystal did not shatter. It screamed. A psychic shriek that tore through the minds of everyone present. Sound of 1,000 souls crying out in unison as they were violently released. The backlash of energy was apocalyptic. The very air seemed to tear apart. The carefully constructed ritual circle erupted in a column of impossible, colorless flame. The laws of physics, already strained, simply broke. The entity that was Alaric was consumed instantly, its borrowed form disintegrating as the uncontrolled energies it had summoned washed back over it. Other members of the Order were less fortunate. Some were aged to dust in an instant. Others were fused with the stone of the floor or twisted into screaming sculptures of flesh and glass. The dimensional rift, which had been a stable, controlled opening, now became a ragged, festering wound, spewing raw chaos into the world. Thomas was thrown across the chamber, his mind reeling from the psychic blast. He and the few surviving Guardians stumbled back through the collapsing tunnels, reality itself seeming to liquefy around them. They emerged into the black forest under a sky that was no longer silent. The unnatural eclipse had been broken, but the heavens were now filled with shimmering auroras and strange new constellations. The Magnum Maleficum had failed. The grand invasion had been averted, but this was no clean victory. The days and weeks that followed, the true cost became apparent. The Guardians had not sealed the gates. They had shattered them. Across Europe, at every site where the Order had performed their ritual, the world was left with scars. These were not just physical ruins, but permanent weaknesses in the dimensional barriers. The great cosmic entities, the Order's patrons, had been driven back, their connections severed by the ritual's catastrophic failure. But the lesser beings, the scouts and parasites that had slipped through during the convergence, were now trapped in our world. These creatures, cut off from their home dimensions and driven by alien hungers, scattered into the dark places of the world. They became the source of countless new legends, the monsters that haunted remote forests, things that whispered from the bottom of old wells, the nightmares that preyed on isolated villages. The age of myth, which had been slowly fading, returned with a vengeance, but it was a darker, more malevolent mythology. The grueling battle was over, but a new, endless, grueling watch had just begun. The surviving Guardians, their numbers decimated. Their minds scarred now, had a new, permanent duty: to monitor these dimensional wounds, to hunt the creatures that had slipped through, and to ensure that no one ever again pieced together the forbidden knowledge that could threaten to unmake the world. Thomas, the apprentice, had survived. But he had inherited a terrible legacy, a lifetime of vigilance against the echoes of alchemy's darkest truth. The catastrophic failure of the Magnum Maleficum did not bring peace to the world. It brought a new, more insidious kind of chaos. The Great War in the Shadows was over, but its aftershocks would continue to shape human history in ways that were subtle, profound, and largely misunderstood. The Guardians had won a victory, but they had inherited a wounded and haunted world, and their grueling watch was far from over. The most immediate legacy of the Order's work was the corruption left behind at their ritual sites. These places, now permanently scarred by dimensional energies, became sores on the face of Europe. They were shunned by locals, who knew only that the ground was soured, that crops would not grow there, and that those who lingered too long were prone to madness and night terrors. Folk tales sprang up to explain these blighted zone stories of ancient curses, fairy courts, or the graves of forgotten demons. The truth that these were the battlefields of a secret cosmic war was too vast and terrible for the medieval mind to comprehend. The lesser entities that had been pulled through the rifts were now a permanent part of the world's ecosystem of fear. These were not demons in the theological sense. They were beings of pure, alien hunger, operating on principles that had nothing to do with good or evil. They became the things that lurked in the deep woods, the misshapen creatures glimpsed at twilight, the voices that whispered from abandoned ruins. The Guardians spent their lives hunting these beings, a thankless, unending task of supernatural pest control. The Order of the Golden Death, though shattered as an organization, was not entirely destroyed. The most powerful and transformed of its members had survived the ritual's backlash. No longer requiring physical bodies in the same way, they retreated into the dimensional folds, becoming mythic figures, the hidden masters and secret chiefs of a new generation of occult conspiracies. They learned from their failure, realizing that a direct, overwhelming assault on reality was too risky. They adopted a new strategy, a slow, patient, multi-generational campaign of influence and infiltration. They guided the formation of new secret societies during the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, feeding them fragments of their corrupted knowledge disguised as ancient wisdom. They understood that humanity itself could be used as a tool for the great work, by shaping science, philosophy, and even art in the right directions. They could guide civilization toward a future where the convergence would not need to be forced, but would occur as a natural, inevitable outcome of human progress. On the other side, the surviving Guardians faced their own grueling challenge. They possessed a library of the most dangerous knowledge ever assembled. The captured texts of the Order, they could not destroy this knowledge, for it contained the keys to understanding and fighting the ongoing threat. But they could not allow it to fall into the wrong hands either. Under the leadership of a no-aging Thomas, who would become one of their most respected lore masters. They established hidden archives, sanctuaries of forbidden learning, where this terrible wisdom could be studied and preserved. Their lives became a paradox. To fight the darkness, they had to understand it. They became the world's secret librarians of horror, their lives dedicated to studying the very texts that could destroy them. They trained new generations not as alchemists, but as scholars and watchers, teaching them to recognize the signs of the Order's influence in the world. They were fighting a war of information, a battle to preserve the truth of what had happened and to prepare for the day when the threat might rise again. The official history, of course, recorded none of this. The Church, in a desperate attempt to restore order and prevent mass panic, systematically suppressed the truth. The events of the Convergence were officially explained away as a particularly severe outbreak of demonic possession and heresy. The alchemists were condemned as simple sorcerers and fools. The true cosmic nature of the threat was deliberately buried under layers of theological dogma and political propaganda. The grueling secret war that had decided the fate of reality was reduced to a curious footnote in the history of medieval superstition, and so the world forgot. But the world was not the same. It carried within it the hidden scars, the sleeping entities, and the two secret organizations, one seeking to transform the world into something alien, the other desperately trying to hold it together. The legacy of alchemy's dark truth was not an open wound, but a slow, hidden fever that would continue to shape the destiny of a world that no longer even knew it was sick. And so, the medieval period drew to a close, its end marked not by a single event, but by the slow, inexorable turning of history's great wheel. The age of faith gave way to an age of reason. The age of castles gave way to an age of cannons. But the secret history, the one written in coded manuscripts and sealed in hidden vaults, continued. The grueling life of the medieval alchemist did not truly end. It merely transformed, retreating deeper into the shadows of a world that was becoming both more enlightened and more dangerously naive. The legacy of the Order of the Golden Death and the Guardians who opposed them became the stuff of whispers, fragmented and misunderstood. The alchemical laboratories, with their furnaces and alembics, were replaced by the laboratories of the new sciences. But the fundamental ambition to understand and command the forces of nature remained. The surviving members of the Order and their descendants were patient. They saw the rise of modern chemistry, physics, and eventually atomic science, not as a rejection of their ancient art, but as its powerful, if unwitting, continuation. They infiltrated the royal societies, the universities, and the research institutions of the modern world, guiding human knowledge from within, always steering it toward the ultimate goal of the final convergence. They no longer needed to perform crude rituals with blood and bone. Their new tools were far more subtle and far more powerful. Particle accelerators that could probe the very structure of matter, genetic engineering that could rewrite the code of life, and information networks that could shape the thoughts of billions. The grueling work of the past had been outsourced to machines and to a global population that had no idea of the true purpose behind the progress they celebrated. The language of their work changed. From the poetry of sulfur and mercury to the cold precision of mathematics and quantum mechanics, but the underlying goal was the same: to open the doors of perception, to breach the final barriers of reality. On the other side, the guardians of the natural order also adapted. Their mission of vigilance continued, passed down through generations. They became the quiet dissenters, the historians who saw unsettling patterns in world events, the scientists who warned of the ethical dangers of unchecked technological advancement, and the philosophers who reminded a world obsessed with progress of the ancient wisdom it was in danger of forgetting. Theirs remains a grueling, thankless task. They fight a war that most of humanity does not even know exists, against a threat that has learned to disguise itself as progress. Thomas, the apprentice who survived the horrors of Alaric's workshop, spent the rest of his long life transcribing the Order's secrets, creating an archive that would serve as a warning for future generations of guardians. He died an old man in a secluded monastery, his hands still stained with the chemicals of his youth, his mind a library of terrible truths. His final writings speak not of victory, but of the unending nature of the struggle. "The thirst for forbidden knowledge," he wrote, "is a fire in the human soul. It can provide light and warmth, but if it is not tended with wisdom and humility, it will consume the world." And so, as you lie in the quiet of your modern world, surrounded by the fruits of a science that was born in those smoky medieval workshops, perhaps you can feel the echoes of that ancient, grueling struggle. The story of the medieval alchemist is a cautionary tale, a reminder that the line between knowledge and power, between enlightenment and corruption, is dangerously thin. The dark truth behind their art was not that they failed to turn lead into gold, but that they succeeded in opening doors that were never meant to be opened. And in doing so, they began a process that has never truly stopped. The great work continues in ways both seen and unseen, and the final convergence, so narrowly averted centuries ago, may simply have been postponed. The grueling life of the alchemist, with all its sacrifice and all its horror, was only the beginning. And so our journey through the smoke and shadows of the alchemist's world comes to a quiet end. The flickering light of the Athanor has died down, and the bubbling retorts fall silent. We leave behind the men who sought to grasp the secrets of creation in their stained and trembling hands. Theirs was a grueling life, a path that began with the noble pursuit of knowledge, the dream of perfecting matter and healing the human body. They were seekers, scholars, and craftsmen, dedicating their lives to a quest that promised enlightenment and an end to the world's imperfections. But as we have seen, that path often led not to wisdom, but to madness, not to gold, but to the grave. The quest for power, for immortality, for dominion over life and death, became a corrosive poison, twisting noble intentions into monstrous acts. The grueling physical labor of the forge was nothing compared to the grueling weight upon the soul. As they ventured into realms of sorcery and sacrifice from which there was no clean return, their ambition was a fire that gave them light, but ultimately it consumed them, leaving behind only cautionary tales whispered in the margins of history. Now, let the echoes of their story fade. Leave behind the scent of sulfur and the whispers of forbidden texts. The great work is finished for tonight. The crucibles are cool. The battles fought in the shadows of history have fallen silent, leaving only the quiet of your room. May your own dreams be free of such burdens, filled instead with peace and stillness. The alchemist's long night is over, and now yours can truly begin. Rest well.